Good afternoon and welcome to all of you. My name is Simon Reid-Henry and I'm the Director of the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences here at Queen Mary, University of London. It's my pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon to today's book launch event for From Toleration to Religious Freedom. Spanning from the early modern period to the present day, the book explores how discourses on toleration impact on current debates about religious freedom. More profoundly, it asks about the relationship between religion and law. And I'm delighted that we have all four of the book's editors with us here today to discuss some of the themes of the book and to bring them into the context of contemporary scholarship and some questions that we think really echo across the disciplines. So let me welcome in particular, and in the order in which we will ask them each to speak. First of all, Dr Marietta van der Tol, who is the lead editor for the book, and is Alfred Landecker, postdoctoral fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, where she examines the role that political imaginaries play in the formation of law and public policy, particularly with regard to religious minorities in Europe. Next, we have Dr. Emily Kempson, who is lecturer and tutor in theology at Mellitus College, where her research focuses on a retrieval of the ancient Christian understandings of God as truth and its relevance from contemporary theological and philosophical discourse. We have as well Dr. Carys Brown, who is research fellow in history at Trinity College, Cambridge, and whose primary interests are in the social, cultural, and religious history of late 17th and 18th century Britain, and in particular, the social history of religious tolerance and education and upbringing of children. And then finally, we have our own Dr. John Adenitire, who is strategic lecturer in law at Queen Mary, University of London. And his research focuses on the legal right to exemption for religious and non-religious conscientious objectors from a wide variety of legal obligations, including anti-discrimination norms. And of course, John also works on the matter of religious freedom. Now, the format for today is as follows. In a moment, I'll hand over to Marietta, who's going to introduce some of the basic themes of the book and the making of it, before we then hear from each of our panelists in turn about some of their contributions and their thoughts and take-homes from what the book includes. We'll then have time for me to pose some questions to each of the panelists to bring a bit of a discussion into play, which you are then also all invited to join. And at that point, please do begin to post your questions in the chat and I can then put those to the speakers. So we hope to have a more open discussion towards the end of our approximately hour and a half with a view of finishing at 3:30. So really looking forward to hearing more about the book, about the making of it, and about some of the ideas that I know touch upon subjects that we all work upon. And with that, Marietta, I will hand over to you. Just to note, Marietta speaks softly, so please do turn up your volume if you find any of the text hard to hear. But I'm sure we've just tried it all. It should be working very well. So Marietta, looking forward to hearing a little bit more about the book. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you and good afternoon to everyone who has joined us. Thank you to Simon and to John for kindly hosting this book launch. And I'm also delighted to see all the editors here, as well as several of the contributors to the book in the audience. So it's just a lovely time to kind of reconvene almost. So John asked me to introduce a little bit about the book. So the book is titled From Toleration to Religious Freedom. And we debated for a long time whether that should have a question mark or not, and precisely because for some of us it is a question, for some of us it isn't a question, because perhaps we think toleration and religious freedom are very different things, or perhaps because we think they should be different things. And I think this is a tension that we have all encountered as we were working on this book, as we were working on the conference that this book is based on a couple of years ago. But let me tell you a little bit about how this came about. So all four of us work in different disciplines. Carys Brown works in history, Emily Kempson works in theology and divinity, John Adenitire works in law, and my own background is in political science as well as a little bit of law, a little bit of history, and a little bit of theology. So I've met each of these wonderful people in very different settings, some with the Arts and Humanities Research Council, others perhaps at research training, how to do collaborative research. So bringing all these people together was, I think, the first step to see, like, you know, what are the themes that they're working on? What are the common questions that we have? But what are also the challenges that we have for each other's field? And it's needless to say that we had such disagreements about concepts, about methodologies, about, again, the fundamental question, can we compare toleration and religious freedom directly? So the question was then, what would happen when we bring this all together? I already mentioned there is different use of concepts. So some people would want to distinguish toleration from religious freedom, for example, because toleration implies negative or adverse normative judgment on somebody who is othered, and then you restrain the power that you have to harm them. But there's also the view that perhaps toleration is about respecting certain differences. And when we talk about religious freedom, perhaps that's again what the problem is. Can we actually respectfully coexist? What are the sorts of issues that we run into as societies? And then there are questions about how do we distinguish actually freedom of conscience from the freedom of religion? Is conscience just about things that have to do with religion? Or can conscience also speak about issues that don't necessarily derive from religion per se? And this came to the fore particularly in the work of John Adenitire. The second thing is different methodologies. And this is an interesting thing because there are some debates among historians, for example, about the question to what extent you're allowed to make comparisons between, say, the early modern period and the contemporary contexts that each of us study. Can we make those comparisons from context to context, but also can we make comparisons from concept to concept? And what are the costs of that if we engage in that sort of conceptual comparison? Might mean we are maybe less attentive to historical detail, and that might then perhaps upset some historians, rightly so. So there are some common issues with the methodology that we had to work out and work through. And then there are different approaches. So one can go about this question in a normative way, perhaps in an explorative way, or perhaps in a descriptive way. And each of our disciplines prescribe certain limits to the ways in which we can approach these questions. So that was the third challenge. So we've had conceptual differences, we've had methodological differences, and then we had differences of approach. But when we bring this together, we can actually learn from each other quite a lot about each other's assumptions, about also the richness of the literature and the discussions that exist in different disciplines, and also to kind of find a way to communicate not so much cross-purpose, but cross-disciplinary, so that we can actually benefit from each other's work and help each other grow in engaging those questions from a slightly wider and richer perspective. There are some key insights that I think stem from this book. The first one is the necessity to look beyond concepts and really look at the circumstances in which those concepts are used. So one of the things that we realized is that perhaps even though toleration sounds more negative, it actually depends on the context to see if toleration actually yields a worse result than religious freedom. That is not necessarily a given. And that is perhaps for those who study law and politics a little bit unsettling, because some of us see toleration as something that's explicitly negative, and then how can toleration in any circumstance yield a more inclusive result than a religious freedom would? So that is one of the learning points. Another learning point is that intolerance can still be expressed in law. This was shown in several of the chapters in the book, how contemporary legal structures still facilitate intolerance, particularly to Muslim communities, but also to Jewish communities. And that's something that we need to be more attentive to, perhaps as lawyers. I also think that it has helped us to see beyond certain narratives of progress, certain teleological narratives about what toleration and religious freedom do in society. So instead of looking at this as a linear development or even a development at all, we could look at certain spaces of conflict and actually see that a lot of these conflicts re-emerge in different in different contexts and in different ways throughout history. And sometimes it might mean you do a couple of steps forward, but then you take a couple of steps back afterwards, and it's not so straightforward to say that there was this development. So we move away from that sort of progressivist narrative, particularly as a challenge to, in this case, political scientists and legal scholars. I think the second thing is that we have to distinguish between different forms of othering. So several chapters in the book talk about the intolerance that was shown to atheists or to Roman Catholics in Protestant spaces, or perhaps to Protestants in Roman Catholic spaces. Also talk about Jewish communities. And when people are at the receiving end of intolerance, they might be at the receiving end of intolerance, but it might not mean that they are at the receiving end of intolerance in the very same way. And I think distinguishing what othering is articulated, what othering is expressed through specific instances of intolerance helps us to be more precise about who is in power and empowered to other, and in what way the othering actually reflects on society. Is this othering a temporary issue? Is this othering a permanent issue? Can somebody belong if they make certain changes or assimilate, or are the differences so perceived to be so significant that true inclusion isn't possible? So the second point, distinguish between different forms of othering. Now, more positively, I think what we have taken away from this is that we can gain a conceptual depth from engaging with the different disciplines. So looking at theology and divinity, what we see in this space is that we can learn more deeply how imaginaries of society, how they work, not so much from like a societal perspective, but from a theological perspective. What are the structures of thought and of belief that underlie certain understandings of who is other, who is different, and who should and shouldn't be tolerated? But also, for example, in political thought, the discussions about what it means to be free, what it means to not just be tolerated, but to have actual equality, of actual freedom, of actual liberty. Those are questions that are explored in greater depth sometimes than they are in perhaps historical studies or in positivist legal studies. I think from the lawyers we can learn that we might talk about religious freedom in all sorts of ways, but in society there is a certain defined way of talking about religious freedom, and it's often prescribed through existing law. And for those who haven't studied law, this sometimes it might be a bit of a surprise as well as a constraint, but it helps us to actually engage in a more realistic way with the questions of religious diversity. Now, what can we learn from the historians? I think we can learn a lot from the historians. In fact, the attention to context and the attention to circumstances that they are so well trained in to discern and to study. And this is important because often those who engage in research on religious freedom or on how we coexist as different religious communities, they might come at this question from a very conceptual angle, and that really can obscure some of the historical nitty-gritty background that have really deeply shaped how toleration had developed, how religious freedom developed. And it helps us to be more precise, it helps us to be more attentive to people who lived in very specific spaces in very specific times, and sometimes even put faces to very real conflicts, very real violence. And it's not just, oh yes, there was violence in the 17th or the 16th century, but actually there were people who lived through this, and that makes a huge difference. I think the last point is that we have really benefited from the interfaith panel that Emily Kempson has put together for the kind of a closing session for the conference. At this point, we had invited some representatives from faith communities, but also from non-faith communities. And what we found is that a lot of these, as we say, religious communities, I use that that term with a little bit of liberty here, is that we write about them, we speak about them, but we don't speak with them. And I think what it teaches us is that we have to be much more involved with engaging stakeholders and listening to their stories, because what it shows is that even though there is religious freedom today, there can still be very real challenges to specific minorities who actually aren't so well protected in the law. And Jewish people will tell you about this, Muslim people will tell you about this, but also gay people will tell you about this, or people who might not have any particular religious perspective, but might feel that in certain circumstances they are pressed into a religious space or in a religious mode of expression. And to listen to those stories actually gives, I think, a deeper understanding on a human level of what we're talking about. So it's not just academics, it's not just an interesting inquiry or a bit of research for some specialists to dive in. This is a lived experience for a lot of people, and we do well to listen to them. So those were my points by introducing the book. What I would very much recommend is that obviously you buy the book. That's what we like people to do if you haven't got it already, but also look at how the different chapters engage some of these major themes. And we don't have time to go into the details of all this at this point, but what we have really seen is that our authors have put so much time and effort in thinking through these key questions and have had to negotiate all these different disciplinary limits and benefits, and that is really a huge challenge, and our authors have done really quite well, and we like to thank them for that, and we heartily recommend their chapters in the book as well. I think with that I will hand back to Simon for the next bit of our program.
Thank you so much, Marietta. I mean, you raised some really, as does the book, some really fascinating questions, and I'm looking forward to having a chance for us to get into some of them at least, even if not, as you say, all of them in the full depth they may merit. I don't know whether either Emily or Carys or John want to each come in with a few thoughts themselves about their contributions, and then I've got some questions that'd be really interesting to hear each of your perspectives on. So. Carys, I don't know if we perhaps start with you.
Yeah, sure. And just as Marietta was talking about the contributions that historians might make, for instance, I was thinking about what historians could get from this volume, and what I feel I've got from this volume as a historian. And I think it's a project that it would be potentially possible to come in with a certain arrogance to as a historian, because it's particularly as an early modern historian, because there's perhaps a perception that while early modernists have worked out that we didn't have a kind of straight forward march of progress from sort of, intolerance towards tolerance and freedom, that perhaps this kind of historical detail, the fact that it wasn't a linear process, isn't always reflected in writing sort of political thought. But I think actually what I think the volume really challenges us as historians to do is to say, okay, well, if you're saying that this change didn't happen in a linear way, how can you account for change? Because clearly something changed. And I think particularly in my field, which I've tended to focus on coexistence, so kind of daily practices of tolerance, it's often very difficult to account for change because it so depends on context. And I think a couple of the chapters are really helpful in broadening out and thinking about how ideas changed over time, but being really sensitive to historical context. So for instance, John Coffey's chapter on religious freedom becoming a natural right and situating that very closely in the kind of the thought of the time. And also Sarah Scholl's article, for instance, which spans from the 16th to the 21st centuries, which is not a kind of time span that is very frequently covered. So I found it really helpful to read through those things and think more carefully about how, it's all very well saying it didn't change in this way, but how did it change? And then I think that the second thing that I found really useful for thinking about is thinking about cultures of exclusion, and thinking about how paradoxically any concept that's inclusive, for instance, you know, tolerance for a particular group can end up being, or tolerance for a particular idea can end up then being exclusive. I think Olga Pierce's chapter, for instance, really highlights this in its emphasis on how joint usership agreements over religious buildings might then be sort of threatened when the faiths that share them disagree over the use of space for particular things, particularly same-sex marriage. So yeah, I think from my perspective, those two things, thinking about change over a longer perspective and how you account for that, and how you do that with sensitivity to both historical and contemporary understanding of particular terms, and then thinking about the paradoxes that you have in cultures of inclusion and exclusion has been really useful.
Yeah, thanks, Carys. I mean, I think you're right, and the book gives a good. I mean, it covers a huge amount of ground, and you know, that can be a challenge, but it can also open up lots of really good questions. And I think, as Marietta was saying at the start, if you're able to embrace those in a kind of interdisciplinary conversation, then often it can bring a whole host of new perspectives to bear. And Emily, if I can bring you in at this point, because you know, in a sense, you represent the religious studies corner of the quad here. You know, so what things? Some of these questions are age old in the context of religious studies. So what new insights came out of putting those questions into dialogue alongside the perspectives of historians, of political scientists, of law, and so forth?
I think a number of the things that Marietta and Carys have brought up also echoed in terms of the benefits within theology and religious studies as a discourse. For instance, as Marietta was saying, the renewed appreciation for how much different conceptual or theological commitments will play out differently in different points in history. About one of the questions we thought about while preparing for this was, how has this putting the book together affected our own work? And I have to say, I was working on an article about a woman named Anne Conway in the 17th century, who was a philosopher and a theologian. And I think that, looking at the historical context for theological and philosophical writings is always important. But having worked on this project made me much more attuned to how significant her conversion to Quakerism at the end of her life would have been, a significant, really political step, not simply a switch in metaphysical commitments, given the context of the Quakers at that point within English society in the wake of the Civil War. And so I think that there's a joke about an analytic philosopher who put on his door a warning to his students: just say no to history of philosophy, because of the desire to sort of exist in the rarefied world of like, what are the concepts, what are the pure ideas? And I think sometimes for theologians, there can be a similar temptation that you want to speak to sort of ultimate coherence and something that really holds together conceptually. And being in dialogue with historians and lawyers trying to work out the nitty-gritty of, well, what do we actually mean when we talk about religious freedom, and what does that permit people to do, does a good job of grounding that discussion and realizing that you do always have to say yes to the history of theology and the history of religious groups and what the commitments are. I think that another really helpful takeaway was to see how one of the main insights recently in religious studies over the past couple decades has been an interrogation of the category of religion in and of itself. That for a long time, there was a presumption that there was a conceptual coherence to this category, that we could distinguish religions from other worldviews in a straightforward, not ad hoc way. And the interrogation has led to a realization that there isn't that sort of coherence to it, and that which is of course very important when it's the study of religion, because if it turns out what counts as a religion is more a social convention based in its own historical context of the Abrahamic faiths, and then a development of sort of, okay, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, what when you get to something like a very well-developed nationalism or humanism and those sorts of things, there's no clear conceptual boundaries between them. And while in theology and religious studies, we've been working through the repercussions for our disciplines, it was really illuminating to see, for instance, John talking about some of the repercussions within the legal sphere. Sort of once we have enshrined in law protecting particular religious freedoms, how does that play out for groups of people who we would not traditionally have thought of as holding a religion, but have a community and a worldview that structures their lives. One of the individuals who contributed to both the panel, or the groups, I should say, to both the panel and the chapter about the religious and worldview panel in the book, is actually Humanist UK. And that addition to our conversation was incredibly illuminating about how what one might presume about what is valued in toleration or religious freedom, or what is seen as detrimental, is often quite different from what one might expect. And so even though cross-disciplinary work is very challenging and sometimes feels a bit rudimentary, in the sense that you have to go back over your own presuppositions and say the things which are unsaid and presumed in your own discipline, and hope for the patience of people from other disciplines to do the same, because those have to be re-articulated. It ends up being incredibly rewarding, because it permanently expands the horizon of how you consider your own field and what you think its repercussions to be. One more story. I remember one particular point in I forget if it was a conference or pulling together the book, when a more legal perspective was trying to ask sort of, well, what ought we to do? Like, if that's problematic, what this says here, what ought it to say? And a historian was sort of like, but we don't deal in normative judgments. That's it's sort of beyond the purview of, we're describing what happens and its effect and so forth. And that may be a bit of a caricature, but those sorts of conversations, I think, are what really bring out the cross-pollination of thought and insight that can only happen when we get out of our circles of expertise and engage with other ones as well.
So I think it would be great to come back to some of these questions around interdisciplinarity in a moment, but this might be a good moment to bring you in, John, because I think a lot of what Emily says there about in a sense about the intellectual history of theology within the kind of modern university context, I think is quite fascinating. It's quite interesting to think about where theology and religious studies would have been and were positioned relative to the culture wars that sort of raged in the 80s and 90s, and how really the aftermath of those has shaped the setting for interdisciplinary work in the current context. But let's come to those in a second. John, my first question to you was going to really focus again upon this question of what you feel your discipline has got out of it. Emily raises some useful insights, I think, when we think about the distinctiveness between power and authority, the distinctiveness between those sort of hard law, as you would call them, elements, and the soft law of ideas, of normative assumptions. This is something that legal studies is heavily involved in. How's this sort of played out for you and your discipline, and what things do you bring back from this project to your colleagues in law, and the kinds of questions that you're all equally engaged in asking and developing and trying to find new angles upon?
Yeah, thank you, Simon, for that. Carys was speaking about the arrogance of historians when they come to the subject of toleration and religious freedom. But I think more arrogant than historians, we have lawyers, especially the practicing ones, the judges and the like, but also academics, and I have to include myself. So when we talk about religious freedom, we think of it primarily, at least from a legal perspective, as a legal construct, right? And when we think about religion, the real manifestation of thinking about the concept of religion in life comes when someone in a position of authority, say a judge, tells you, well, this particular worldview or this particular community you have that you keep calling a religion actually doesn't count as a religion. And we see that in recent times. I think, of course, this may be it'd be problematic, but in the European Court of Human Rights, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster has been trying for several years. Of course, in the European Court of Human Rights, it's just the last reiteration of this struggle to categorize themselves as religions, because they understand the benefits and the privilege that comes with that legal category. So in my work, I think prior to this project, I took seriously this idea that there could be something objective to this category of religion, something that justified the othering in judicial discourse of certain groups. Okay, so you belong to the category of a religion, you do not. And I was trying to, I think, by reference to what Emily was saying to the analytical philosophers, to find, by ignoring theological studies, by ignoring history, by ignoring all sorts of actually previous knowledge, that there was a conceptual purity to religion. But yes, I think I was participating in this project, and more generally in cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary work. All my arrogance was revealed to be vacuous, totally without foundation. And that our religious studies scholars have long shown that this idea of religion as something that exists in itself, something that is objective, is just a fantasy, really. That what we have to do is trace the history of our conceptions of religion, or better, to trace the history of the conceptions of religion of those that have power. Right, because their own conceptions is what then shapes the lived realities of people that denied the privileges of being categorized as religious or not. And then once we start doing this historical, which is historical of idea project, a history of ideas project, we see the political repercussions of our conception of religion, of religious freedom, of toleration, and we see them as not inevitable. They could have been otherwise, depending on the social, cultural, political, theological context. And we see the political uses of conceptions of religion across space and time. And so this is what this work has brought to me, a renewed sense of humbleness, right? That the very basic ideas that we have been taking for granted in religion, and that judges use today to deny people rights, privileges, etc. They are built on foundations of nothing. They are built on foundations of arrogance, rather than genuine attempts to understand the historical, philosophical foundations of the very concepts that shapes people's lived experiences. So I couldn't praise this project any more highly, and projects of this kind. Not because, of course, we have a book to sell, which, by the way, you should buy, is very reasonably priced, especially if you're a university library, but because the intellectual fruits of this kind of work are just outstanding, and I live them in my academic growth.
So you pick up there, John, as in a sense, Carys and Emily did before you, and Marietta in her opening comments around the importance of context. And of course, our disciplines are also a context. They're the context from which we reach out, and we are, to differing degrees, different disciplines, good at problematizing those and understanding the politics behind the heuristics we each take into different sort of analytical situations, including the analytical philosophers. But I wonder what that engagement with other people's contexts has each given you, and I guess this is a question that cuts two ways. On a simple level, what is it that you think has forced you to think differently about your own discipline through doing this, And then at the same time, is there anything that you think actually isn't quite the way you would do it in the other disciplines from the insights that you've had into each other's work? Have you sort of come away thinking, well, there is a reason I'm a historian after all, or not on a kind of ad hominem level, but in terms of thinking about the ways in which disciplines answer questions. So have there been things that you particularly have taken to heart through doing this and learned and will take back to your own discipline and your own discipline discussions, and other elements that you really think it's an argument to be won still that you would take to? And I confess to this, I'm a geographer right often across other disciplines, including history. There are still areas of history, I think, they talk about the importance of context. I would still like to see that more worked through. So I'm happy to have those arguments. Are there similar issues that have emerged in your work here, Carys? So I don't know, maybe start with you as the historian, and give ourselves one moderately arrogant subject to start with. I don't think that's true at all. I think it's I don't think any of you would be here if you were really representative of arrogant disciplines, but bastions of knowledge, let's call it that. We'll start with you, Carys.
Well, while John and I are in a sort of competition to be more deferent, I have to say, as he was saying that, that perhaps lawyers haven't paid attention to historical context, I was thinking, well, perhaps historians haven't really been particularly helpful in helping them to do so. And I think one thing that really struck me and has really helped me in terms of working with other disciplines is just thinking about the concepts that historians are using, the words that historians are using, that are usually drawn out of their out of contemporary writing, or out of how contemporaries are using terms, which is good and helpful and useful for thinking about contemporary ideas, but then might become problematic when we then use them casually when talking to people in other disciplines. So the thing that particularly came up, I remember, and I can't remember whether it was in, I think it might be in preparing the introduction for the book, or perhaps even the abstract for the conference, discussing with John, talking about conscience. And when in the period I'm looking at, when people talk about conscience, it's inherently about religion. It's inherently about your religious faith, because for contemporaries, conscience was connected to human beings' relationship with God. But in John's work, conscience does not necessarily have any relationship to religion at all. And I think historians, if we want people to pay attention to the context that we might be able to bring, need to think really carefully about how far we're explaining the concepts that we're using that might have changed in their meaning, and that we're sensitive to the ways that they might mean something different in another discipline. I mean, in terms of identifying sort of things that irritated me about other disciplines, I don't think there's a huge amount, really. I think there are always going to be different ways of doing things, and I think historians often struggle with sort of what we might see as schematic frameworks for understanding stuff, because it is often about the kind of context. And I think there's sort of one. I think there's perhaps still the Enlightenment as a period is one that really seems to stick as a concept of sort of enlightenment emerging from a period of darkness, and changing ideas almost for the better, that kind of value judgment that comes with that. I think does maybe still stick in some areas of other disciplines, and I guess that's something that that's something the project sought to challenge. But I think I got a lot more from other disciplines than I thought. There was than any negatives I thought about other disciplines. So it's very positive for me.
Fabulous. Marietta, I noticed you were smiling away knowingly there.
Yes, so I think what I really got out of this project was, sorry, I should go back to the whisper. I'm getting excited. What I was really getting out of this project was a more thorough grounding in each of the other disciplines that I was trying to engage. So at the time I was kind of experimenting. I was writing my dissertation on politics of religion, and the subtitle was Toleration, Religious Freedom and the Visibility of Religion in Public Space. And so I was engaging this question with some history, with a bit of law, with a bit of theology, and obviously with political theory. But no human can actually have a thorough understanding of each of those fields by just studying all those by themselves. You have to be willing and able to learn from others. So for me, this project really brought in a set of literature that I may not have known of, or a deeper understanding of core discussions within those disciplines that I may not have been fully aware of. And also just the curiosity about each other's discipline, each other's work, and actually, all the little gems that you can take away from listening very carefully to what others have to say. Now, speaking about irritations, I don't tend to have many, but if I could mention one, it would probably be when lawyers get on their positivist horse and refuse to engage beyond kind of the written law. And I find it sometimes a challenge, particularly because I studied in that same tradition. I did an undergraduate and graduate degree in constitutional law in a positivist tradition. So I've come to know that tradition, but I've also felt like I wanted to engage wider than that. So I think when I encounter that sort of rigidity about the legal subject, that's why I get kind of excited, like, but we can do this in a so much more interesting way, in my opinion. So that's perhaps like a slight irritation, but I think resoundingly positive experience with actually, finding other people in the same university or at the same level who are willing to think about these questions. I couldn't have wished for better peers at the time of writing my dissertation.
That's right. We jest a little about that being overly different or intellectual frustrations with each other, but I think often the ways in which these resolve most constructively is when we do bring those questions together and bring those perspectives, and a large sort of edited project such as this is such a good way of doing it. John, I noticed you were wanting to come in on that last point, so I'll bring you in here.
Yeah, no, I do have one bit of irritation, which I'm very happy to share. So I remember in the conference that led to the publication of the volume, talking about why particular historical theorists, their views about atheism and how Catholics and atheists were unreliable subjects, right? And I remember making a comment. I can't remember about which particular historical figure. It might have been male. It might have been someone else, and saying, well, this particular historic figure is clearly wrong. Atheists are reliable people, and they can be good subjects, and so can Catholics. And being met with a shock in the room by historians saying, well, we don't really speak in that way, i.e. we don't interrogate authors from the past from a normative perspective, right? We try to understand where they got their views from, and now their views developed, and we look to the context in which they were writing, and then we try to explain those views from that perspective. But I thought that was quite irritating, because it kind of takes these figures out of the context in which they were writing. They were writing to make a point to other people in their time. But if they're anything like us, they were also trying to make a view that applied more widely than their particular context. So I think we ought to, especially from a philosophical perspective, take the views of past historical figures seriously, and take their work and their charges and their beliefs as if they were, and talk to them as if they were in the room together with us today. And yes, it's very well and good to understand where they're coming from, right? We should have that ability to understand where people are coming from, even today, even to contemporary scholars, but we shouldn't treat, at least that was my view, that we shouldn't treat historical figures as if their work was finished when it was written, right? That it wasn't engaged in a process of continuing conversation with people from their own future. So I think that was the challenge that I gave back to some of the participants, especially I think more the intellectual historians or more the historians in the room, that we should not think of past political thinkers as dead thinkers, but as alive and engaged in a continuous conversation with us. But I accept that. I think we have all been praising this this project because it's been so extremely enriching, so extremely challenging. Yes, not necessarily just the efforts of bringing together a volume, a major conference, but in terms of challenging our own basic assumptions. Yes, Carys was speaking about this difference between conscience, understood from a historical perspective as something that was inherently religious, and the contemporary idea that conscience is actually has to just do with moral beliefs, and moral beliefs, of course, can be theologically informed or religiously informed, but they need not. So I think that ability to challenge our own assumptions is what all the academic endeavor is supposed to be about, right? Challenging basic beliefs, challenging basic ideas, and this way to this is a wonderful way. Cross-disciplinary effort is a wonderful way to do so. So I'd really recommend it to other scholars in the room.
It'd be good to come on to what each of your understanding of the contemporary resonance of this work is in a moment. But I just want to pick up on something you said there, John, which is about you had a nice phrase. You talked about the future of past intellectuals' ideas, and I think there's something in that. I mean, just to sort of concretize it, when we're talking about law and religion, for example, you think of somebody like a classic figure like John Rawls, and you think about how some of the ideas that he subsequently developed very much in the field of law actually really kind of build upon earlier work undertaken thinking through religion and theology. And so there are these sort of layers of ideas, and they become different at different moments. And there's also this notion of how those ideas get taken and used in different contexts. And I wonder whether this was something that crops up in the work that you're each doing. Again, to take Rawls as the example, here is a framework for a model society, which was very much based upon a kind of, singular liberal type state. And of course, the legacy of that work 10, 20, 30 years afterwards was about other people trying to take that and apply it at a global scale and thinking about really making that work resonate in a very different context. And it's presumably the same, whichever particular corner of the overlap between religion, between toleration, and between sort of normative kind of assumptions that maybe underlie that, or normative commitments. So in the work that you've each kind of brought into the book, have you come with any kind of preformed ideas about how that works, and have you come out with any different understandings about the way in which essentially ideas apply differently in different contexts? Because in a sense, your book is a part of that history itself, right? You've sort of taken this large scale bird's eye view, in a sense, of different contexts, comparative, richly comparative, historically comparative as well. And then that's now going to be taken forward somewhere. So where is it you see it being taken forward? How do you see this being used? And how, whether for good or for worse, some people may take the ideas in different directions. But how do you see it going forward from here? Emily, did you have any thoughts about where the book goes from now?
Yes, I think one of the things about this particular topic of toleration and religious freedom is that never far from anybody's mind is the actual impact it might have on people's lives beyond the academy itself. I mean, you can't pay attention to laws that have this impact or the historical account of people who have dealt with that without having a consideration of what might these discussions have to bear on people's current lived experiences. And I think that one of the things that came out for me from this discussion was that, going into it, I was very aware that different religious communities will have different, when they do live well with people from other sects or from other religions or belief systems, they will often have their own understandings of why they go about doing that. It isn't a, we figured out the right concept for toleration, the right concept for religious freedom, and now every single group can appropriate that for themselves. The reasons tend to be much more indigenous within their own worldviews and metaphysical belief systems and so forth. And what I was struck by from this collaborative interdisciplinary project is how that variation also plays out within different historical contexts and also different legal codes in different points in history and in different nations, different groups, different political units, and so forth. And in that way, it really shifted my sense of what is the best way to go at the overall, if on some level one goal of this kind of work is for there to be greater peace among people of differences and greater freedom in that way. I don't want to sort of push that telos onto everyone, but I think that's a fairly common desire. It forced me to take from my sort of American Jeffersonian raising and background of thinking, if we have the right principle, the right understanding of religious freedom, that will be able to play out beneficially in all sorts of different situations. This helped me really see that practically the way forward has to be much more bespoke to the different situations and the contexts that communities and legal systems or so forth are in, that you can't step away from the histories, you can't step away from the unique backlog of legal structure that a particular nation is working with. You can't bracket particular groups' metaphysics the way Rawls sometimes wishes people would sort of bracket their personal religious views for the public dialogue. And so in terms of where we go from here, it seems to me that these sorts of conversations that play out what would it look like in a particular context with a particular people is really the way forward. And so in that way, having once stepped into a more interdisciplinary sphere, we none of us can afford to pick up the arrogance of our own fields again. I would say that theologians are not immune from the arrogance that Carys and John and so forth talked about. I mean, after all, we talk about like God and truth and everything, but there's a similar sense that once having stepped into this ring, that the only way forward is to continue to have those exchanges, because there won't be a one size fits all in that way.
Yeah, no, exactly, and it's a good riposte to the Rawlsian approach, and I think, I can't remember who, or someone says, you can't not be a utilitarian going into the difference principle. So you are sort of, once you start pro forma-izing things, it becomes very hard to allow for that dialogue to take place, and it's often that the dialogue that's needed. It's why I think this volume is so interesting. I mean, looking at that matter, or picking it up, that matter of principles, Carys, when we talk to historians about principles, where does the conversation go? Where principles they seem to me to lie a little bit outside of ideas. It's not quite concepts. We're working with a slightly different subject matter here. So if, in a sense, part of the way we take the project like this forward is to come around and convene, develop principles that work and are effective for all of this, how do historians take that forward? How do they bring some of their insights in, the history of the ways in which concepts are formed, used, taken forwards, and so forth? How do they take that forward in this discussion?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think, as John's comments have highlighted, historians are deeply uncomfortable with sort of measuring things in the past by principles that we might hold now. I think one of the things that we can think about, however, is the way that a historical context can help us to be less lazy about those principles. So and the other way around as well, I think. So for instance, if we are thinking about, you know, where we might want, how we might want this work to have an impact, you might hope that it helps people to think a bit more deeply about how our current ideas of freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, tolerance, that perhaps we have become a bit lazy about in thinking, okay, well, you know, we're doing much better than the past. I think looking at the historical context can help us to challenge that laziness, because you can see that actually people in the past found ways of rubbing alongside each other that perhaps in a sort of principle context that doesn't quite fit with our own, that actually we can see maybe worked better than the reality of sort of daily life that we have, where we stick to particular principles. So yeah, I think historians are generally uncomfortable with the universal application of principles to the past, but I think that thinking historically can help you to mull over those principles and maybe be a bit more flexible with them.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting argument, and you know, there are lots of insights, John, you mentioned it before, that come from secular ways of thinking that are relevant here, even though we're talking about religion and tolerance, and also on that matter of tolerance. You know, I mean, some of the way that the book frames this makes me think a little bit of Wals's work on tolerance, and there he talks about different regimes of tolerance, and that's a very macro historical take, and it's sort of it's in a sense, it's not quite a sociologist, but it's that kind of structured take on history. And part of what he does there is to sort of demonstrate that different kind of macro political social situations will try to address that problem in particular ways. So here is, in a sense, the palette that you're saying, Carys, we start to work with. We don't suggest that that's what we want. What we try to do is analyze how that worked in the past and to learn from that and to build that into a more critical and, as you rightly put it, less lazy way of thinking through what principles serve, how they work in the present. So, I mean, with that in mind, do you know, either of you, Carys or Emily, have any thoughts about the ways in which you know, one takes this forward as a project? You know, it's a fascinating set of responses and critical engagements that you've got in the book. Is there, we've spoken a little bit about the future of where this idea may be taken in terms of the disciplines. In terms of yourselves, are there ways in which you are thinking you might bring this forward or take it forward? Are you thinking of follow-up work on the topic? And if so, where does that go? It'd be great to hear a little bit about that, or indeed John or Marietta, if either of you have any thoughts on that.
Just to quickly respond, I think that one natural place for theology and religious studies to go with it would be to develop people working within different traditions, develop their own account of what they might call toleration or religious freedom, or an analog within that theological, metaphysical, philosophical system. I think in some ways, in theology and religious studies, because toleration and religious freedom has been a bit of the purview of either people working, you know, out in the world between religious groups as opposed to in the academy, or in the academy more with, you know, as we've seen, historians, political science, academic lawyers, and so forth. There's a way in which our attention has been drawn to other topics and areas. And I think that this really draws out how much it may benefit these discussions and practical work being done on the ground if there is a more robust account that is authentically native to the different belief systems that can then engage in these discussions. And it's really theology and religious studies that's best placed to do that in a way that isn't just a sort of outside imposed, oh, look, it happens to look similar on a superficial level, but is actually deeply rooted in the tradition. So I could see that as a programmatic academic project going forward out of this in my own field.
That's a fascinating way of thinking it through. John, I think you wanted to come in on that too.
Yeah, I think two ways in which I would like to take, and I have been taking this project forward, are the following. One is to think of alternatives to the idea of toleration, right? And so one concept I've been exploring is that of mere civility, which is a concept that is perhaps indistinguishable from toleration, and Teresa Bejan at Oxford has been trying to get us understand this. But we see toleration as a way to manage differences, but a way to manage differences where people try to come together, not to impose harm towards each other, a kind of a way to be still nice. At least toleration sometimes is used in that way, trying to get along with each other while living together, despite our differences. I'm very attracted to this idea of what if we have to live together, but we don't try to get along? Yes. What if we don't try to tolerate each other, but we just stick to the very basic minimum rules of sharing the space, right? Without any effort to even try to understand or like each other, right? I think that more minimalistic framework is very compatible with the legal one, right? Where we, as long as we respect the basic rights of each other, we don't have to like each other, right? So I think that alternative scheme is compatible with Teresa Bejan's mere civility, and is one which I've explored in a special journal issue that Marietta, to which Marietta was a contributor in the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion. And another way in which this kind of interdisciplinary project I would like to take it forward, and be taking it forward, is to see, well, what if mere civility is just not enough, right? What if we need a more robust way of getting along with each other? What if even people that have sometimes incompatible viewpoints, say, you were alluding to this earlier, Simon, religious groups that have views against LGBT sexual morality. What if we can get these groups, the LGBT groups and the religious advocate groups, to actually come together to find ways in which one can advance the legal rights of the others? So we can get religious groups advancing, for example, the rights of sexual minorities by agreeing to a scheme of exemptions, accommodations in law, which would then be crystallized in a series of legal protections from discrimination for LGBT people. And so this is a project I've been exploring over the past few months, and trying to put something to be more solid together, right? To get these people sat in a room and to talk to each other, to agree in a framework that advances the rights of each other, right? In that way. And I think in that way it's impossible not to have cross-disciplinary perspective, having theologians, having lawyers, having philosophers, having policy makers, queer scholars, and the like. So I'm very excited about this new project.
Yeah, you raised a couple of things there, John, that I'd love to pick up on in a second. But I think, Marietta, you wanted to come in as well at this point.
Yes, please. So there's a couple of things that I see would be interesting to explore. Of course, within constitutionalism, there is more attention to intolerances perhaps being expressed in the law, being maintained through the law, being sanctioned through the law. But there's also an assumption that religion simply is religion, whereas when we look historically, religion often can also have to do with what we now call ethnicity, or perhaps what we call race. And when we are more attentive to that sort of inner diversity already within religious minorities in the past, and as well in other minoritized groups, I think we can learn a lot about how, again, like in our time, structural injustices are enshrined in the law that are not just about religion, but that have to do with a whole host of differences. And this is one topic that I've taken up with a colleague in Heidelberg, Elizabeth Becker, and we're organizing a workshop, 2 workshops in fact, and a special issue, trying to disentangle some of these assumptions about, is religion really just about religion? And what else is there to be said, particularly in the light of Muslim minorities, Jewish minorities in Europe, where the question is as relevant today as it was perhaps 500 years ago for others.
So thank you, Mary. I mean, so actually that fits very well with what I wanted to pick up from what John was saying. So in a sense here, and the thrust of this question is, I wonder what social scientists would say to some of this. In a sense, John, what you're talking about is civics, and in a sense, Marietta, what you're talking about is identity. And clearly, both of these are cognate parts of the question of toleration, and where religion and religious freedom fits within that. But John, I mean, the mere civility reference is fascinating, and I think a really, really potentially enlightening way to go. Does it take us away from toleration, or does it lead us into a different form of toleration? I guess would be one question around that, because again, social scientists, one of the things that they often think about when we think of toleration as a form of social interaction or sort of a social norm is that it is a very negative, as you described, minimal. It's a very negative way of engaging with others. It's about things you don't have to do. And I know there are critiques to that position as well. So it would be interesting to hear, John, your thoughts just very briefly about taking it forward in that direction around the idea of what we can take out of the picture rather than always trying to put new elements into the picture, which I think historically has been a good way of doing it. And Marietta, when we get to the question of identity and how that becomes, as you say, religion is a part of identity, and lots of forms of oppression and so on and so forth are related to identity as well as to the religious norms and beliefs and practices and cultural and ethnicity. And so here, I guess, we enter into the other part of the parallel part of the question to John, and that is the role of politics in all of this, and where ultimately political structures come into play to shape the more deep-rooted structural diagnoses that each of your disciplinary contributions and each of the chapters in the book in different ways kind of addresses. So with politics as the endpoint of the question, John and Marietta, it'd be great to just hear a quick response from you about those two observations.
So I think I don't want to be too grandiose about this, but I think one of the fundamental questions of contemporary political theory and politics generally is, how do we live together despite our differences? And to answer this, we often have this idea of toleration, right? Because as we were saying earlier, toleration seems to imply that we all have negative judgments of each other's lifestyles, views, and so forth. But we always stray for utilitarian or pragmatic or even principled reasons. Say if we did not restrain from causing harm to each other, then we would descend into a state of war. Yeah, so at least on those pragmatic grounds, we want to live in peace, then we leave each other. So the concept of toleration fluctuates depending on who is using it, as a way to say, as a negative concept, where it's not just sufficient to put up with each other. Some people want to use toleration more expansively to say, look, let's not just put up with each other, let's genuinely embrace our differences. Yes, of course, the differences may be problematic, may be annoying, may be this or that, but there's richness, yes, in pluralism. Yes, so contrasting this with this idea of mere civility, which I guess brings us back, but is more radical to the first notion of toleration, which is like, not only we do not even want to put up with each other. We are forced to. Politics is organized in a way in which we are forced to live with each other, right? And unless we break the ground rules of democratic polity, then there's no hope for us to like each other or to interact with each other. That's a much more pessimistic view, and mere civility, I think it's worse than toleration in that sense. But it's sometimes the only thing that we have got left. So really thinking about how to frame politics in this way. I used to be a advocate for Rawlsian, the late Rawls, this political liberalism, that we really have to think about structuring society in a way in which, even if people want to just adhere to this idea of mere civility, politics is structured in a way, and our institutions are structured in a way that society doesn't collapse onto itself. And the basic ingredients there is law, right? And seeing law in the liberal tradition, seeing that people are free to interact with each other unless their interactions are harmful to each other or to the public interest. So that brings law as the arbiter of difference. But that's very minimalistic. There's no empathy. There's no love. There's no charity. There's just being obliged to live with each other under a system of law.
Right, but as a thought experiment, it's in the ways you're describing, it's fascinating to think how that plays out and where it leaves us and what tolerance does for us in that context. Marietta, of course, identity is one of the reasons people don't want to live together, leave each other alone, as John talks to. So yeah, it'd be great just to hear a couple more words about your thinking there.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I don't think differences in identity necessarily mean that people cannot live together peacefully. There are certainly examples in history and in the contemporary where that isn't really the biggest divider. But historically, religion has often been a marker of difference. And what we should not forget is that this often involves designation of othering on account of religion or on account of race or on account of ethnicity of somebody else, and that involves an objectification, in a sense a dehumanization of their experience. It's reduced to their religious otherness. And I think when we think about politics, yes, we do need certain categories to work with, but what if actually those categories, like religion, are so reductive that they don't speak to the actual experience of people? Like, think of secular Christians, think of secular Jews, think of secular Muslims. Like, for some reason we assume Jews to be orthodox, we assume Muslims to be observant. Those assumptions aren't right, but in politics those assumptions often do play a role, and I think it helps us to be more critical about how those categories are constructed and imposed, but at the same time also be sensitive to self-identification, where people say, I self-identify as a religious minority, I self-identify as a linguistic minority. There's space for both of those ways of identification, I suppose, but in a political space, we are often limited by very restricted categories to do with religion, race, or ethnicity. And in different political contexts, again, they can mean very different things. The way that we speak about race in the Americas may be different from how race is engaged in Eastern Europe, for example. And it doesn't mean that there is no common ground, but we have to be, again, very careful about the contextualization. Are we talking about the same things? Are we going the extra mile to ensure that the concepts that we use are appropriate in each of these settings, and are concepts that people who live in those settings can recognize themselves in? And that I think, an ongoing challenge for politics, ongoing challenge for the law. But this, I think, shows how much living together is a process. It's a never-ending challenge, and we should not presume that the law ever catches, or that political thought can ever catch those identities in a way that is final and not open for any further challenge or discussion. We're part of a living thing here, and recognizing that by not reifying, not putting law and politics in the corner of the museums, like we go there to see how it's done. No, we are here to explore for ourselves in our own space and time what these things mean. And I think that is a responsibility that each generation of scholars and each generation has in their own political space to figure out.
Thanks, Marietta. I think it's true. I mean, sort of Judith Sklar's points that we, there is no end point we keep having to revisit these questions. We keep having to work through them. Context change, our own moral and intellectual languages change, and there are legacies and constants, but things don't stay the same. And Carys, that sort of makes me sort of want to swing the conversation a little bit back towards you and the historian's perspective. And I liked very much what Marietta was saying there about each generation's challenge in addressing some of these long-standing questions, and in a sense that's partly also where we started. And I noted, I wondered how theology and so forth had played out in the context of the cultural wars of the 80s and 90s, and that was a previous generation struggle in a sense. And then subsequent to that, we had across a lot of the humanities and social sciences, we had the sort of post-colonial moment, we had the postmodern moment, and that was that generation's challenge to address and think through the implications of, to again, often the very same basic questions that we've been asking for a long time. As a historian, of course, history is very much engaged in the debates of the present, the quite politicized debates. A lot of talk about how we decolonize our thinking through some of these questions, and there's an intersectional element to a lot of what we've spoken about today. So just to be lovely towards the end to hear your thoughts a bit about how historians take this forward in the context of the kinds of debates that are live and actual and really kind of happening in the current generational moment within history. And then Emily, I'll come to you in a second with the same question.
Big question. I think, one of the things that, of course, Marietta has been talking a lot about is identity, and identity politics is at the center of kind of contemporary society. I think historians, especially in this context, need to think a lot about stereotypes, and can think a lot about how stereotypes and how stereotypes are formed, but also perpetuated. And I think interdisciplinary work's really important to this. I've been thinking quite a lot myself about anti-Catholicism in the late 17th and 18th centuries, and thinking about how that was perpetuated not just through sort of print and social interaction, but also through the framework of the law and through the frameworks of politics. And I think that that's thinking about how stereotypes are developed in lots of different ways and how they're perpetuated in lots of different ways is one way that historians, I think, can usefully think about the past, but also engage with a lot of what's going on in the present. I think there are also challenges that come with that. There's been lots of work recently, for instance, talking about gender identities and how gender identities have been perceived historically. And one of the real challenges for historians thinking about that and thinking about how stereotypes about gender and sexuality have changed is in thinking about how, again, it comes back to the language and the terms, thinking about how the terms that we use today, what they mean when we apply them to the past, and whether we can trace those things. But I certainly think thinking about stereotypes is one of the ways that we can bring together that kind of social and cultural context with the context of politics and law. And I think that's very helpful for historians.
Thanks, Carys. Emily, is that a task that also could be taken up within contemporary theology and religious studies? Are there emergent areas where these debates become relevant, can be taken forward?
About identity specifically, or were there other ones more broadly you were thinking of?
I was thinking actually across the range of the insights that you've got on religious toleration and religious freedom, and ways in which how that intersects with broader debates within the discipline that are happening at the moment, and kind of that constant looking over our shoulder towards past generations and thinking how we take forward some of those ideas in the present.
I think that it hits on some central pillars of toleration and religious freedom that have for a long time been marked by these sorts of questions. What I'm trying to say is that theology and religious studies is in some ways the oldest discipline. I mean, universities were begun as ways to train priests in late medieval Europe, but in other ways, the religious studies element is very much a a recent addition to it coming out of, the Berlin University and the settlement of Wissenschaft and so forth at that point. And so because theology and religious studies both has this very sort of late modern approach to the study of religion existing alongside living religious, again, we use that term loosely now, religious traditions who are interrogating themselves and what their way of life and way of thinking is to be today in light of the tradition that has gone before them. And so in that way, these you can see within the discipline itself how the methodology will shift significantly, I think almost more than any other discipline that I'm aware of, from one institution to another. Its institutional connections will also change with a high degree of variance from one institution to another. And so in that way, a lot of these questions about if in some way the questions about how when society is no longer explicitly having an establishment, the sort of an established church which all are expected to follow, there's an analog of that question within the discipline itself, that if there is no single methodology that we'll share, our topic, if it is religion itself, has been interrogated and found to be not purely conceptually coherent, then how we work among ourselves, what keeps us together as a field, and what is the beneficial diversity and sometimes being at odds with each other from one sort of subfield to another. I think in a lot of ways you have these same questions that are played out within broader society happening within the discipline itself. And so in that way, there's it can only help to serve that sort of meta reflection within theology and religious studies as a field about how do we consider ourselves in relation to the institutions of society today, both the religious and worldview community institutions, but also how are we serving society as a whole. Within conversations, with policymakers, with historians, and so forth. So I think that this definitely opens a lot of questions, but in a lot of ways, those are questions that my particular field is by its nature inextricable from.
No, and gratefully so. And that thought about the meta reflection is maybe a good place for me to ask the final question, to give you all a chance really for a last set of comments, since we're approaching the end of our time, and thank you to all of you for the discussion. It's been incredibly rich and thought-provoking. But I suppose in a sense what we're moving towards is, or at least what my understanding of this in talking to you all has moved towards, is the sense that the constructions of the world that we make shape the categories we live by, and also that others die by, and that we then have to relate to and tolerate. And I wondered, therefore, since a lot of what we need to tolerate in the world is not necessarily others, but situations, structures, things, and outcomes, was there much discussion in the making of this book, not so much about religious freedoms, but about religious obligations and the ways in which they play out in the present? So let me come to you first, John, and then Marietta, Carys, and then finally Emily, and I'll just wrap up briefly after then. So a big question for a very short response.
Yeah, in terms of obligations, I think these religious obligations in particular, this fed into our discussion of how the law treats claims of religiosity. Whether, say, you had to belong to a scheme, to an institution which had doctrines and which had particular institutionalized obligations. So the best example would be the ban of the burqa, and in some European countries, and some of the women subject to this ban invoking a religious obligation or a matter of religious identity, the wearing of the burqa as a matter of religious identity, but then being opposed by courts saying, look, there are no traditions in which this is a matter of religious obligation. This is something that are certainly culturally motivated, or particular branches of particular readings of Islam lead to this idea, but it's not really a religious obligation. You don't have to do it. And so religious obligation, in a sense, being used by courts, or perceived religious obligations, or lack thereof, being used as a way to push back against claims of religious identity. So we see obligation and identity here used one against each other. But I don't believe this was super central to the book itself, but it came out in the conference which led to the book.
Thanks so much, John. Marietta.
Sure. So yes, religious obligations. I think we often tend to see those in conflict with state law and vice versa, but there is not a necessary opposition. I think what we have found is that often it is about a certain division of tasks, a certain division of responsibilities between different institutions, be that at the state level, be that in the church, or where those are merged still in different spaces of policy making. I think from the perspective of toleration, for obvious reasons, religious obligations must be taken very seriously, and we must be very careful to not lightly impose restrictions on freedom of conscience, or restrictions that imply a restriction of the freedom of conscience. And that is an ongoing discussion in the law and in politics. But again, I don't think we need to always see them as a binary, like where we assume the binary, there's some reflection to do. I think, and just general being a bit more sensitive about what maybe middle ground solutions might be.
Thank you. I can't remember, Emily, was it, did I say we come to you next?
I think that what theology and religious studies might have to offer is a reframing, because of course what comes up in political or the public spheres when there's something seen as controversial that's working against the norms that the state has decided to put forward as in its own interest, when a lot of the times the points of contention can be ones that are considered more peripheral within the religion or the belief system itself. And so in that way, if the conversation about what religious obligations are is one that is just framed about when they become contentious issues within broader society, it runs the risk of distorting what those adherents to the faith actually see as the main commitments that they would adopt from their position of their worldview. And so in that way, I think that we have to be careful about how we end up framing it.
Sounds very, very right. Carys, we'll finish with you, and then I'll just say thanks to everyone.
Yeah, very, very briefly. I mean, I think it, lots of the discussions highlighted and lots of the chapters, I think, highlight the fact that religious obligation is actually often the starting point of toleration. I was thinking particularly about Fiona McCool's writing about sort of God, the attempt of a godly commonwealth to, through what their sense of obligation, to impose particular modes of worship or particular rules on groups of people who equally felt like they had an obligation to act differently. And I think the eventual kind of begrudging tolerance that you get in this, begrudging legal tolerance that you get in this country simply comes out of the fact that there are people who both recognize the importance of religious obligation, but those religious obligations are in tension. And I think, I think that comes through a lot in these discussions. So I think even if we are talking about things like liberty of conscience or religious freedom or tolerance, we're never that far from questions of obligation.
It's exactly, and I think this is really one of the areas for me, but there are others, I'm sure, for others in the audience, where the book touches upon issues of long-standing significance and that are of social and political relevance. So I would simply recommend the book to all of you. I think it's a fascinating read. I'm delighted that we've had a chance to pick the brains of each of the editors today. To Emily Kempson, thank you. To John Adenitire, and to Marietta van der Tol and Carys Brown. Thank you all for your contributions, for your thoughts, and for sharing with us where the book's been, where it's going, and where this is taking each of your disciplines forward. It's been an incredibly rich discussion, and thank you to all of you. Thanks also to the audience for listening, and Yolanda's just posted in the chat a link to the book publisher's website where you can pick up a copy. Thank you to all of you, and I look forward to seeing you at another event soon.